My name is Alice Donaselva, and I am the Managing Director of the Intentional Endowments Network, or IEN for short. IEN is a nonprofit, collaborative, peer learning network where endowment professionals, consultants, and asset managers come together to advance the field of aligning endowments with their institutional mission and values, as well as their performance objectives. We do this through in-person forums and events like this one. Next slide, Nicole. We do this through in-person events and forums like this one, peer networking, sharing resources on investment opportunities, and providing educational venues. Next slide. A few years ago, we created the roadmap for intentional endowments. We had fiduciaries coming to us who are appropriately concerned about preserving and growing their assets, and they felt like this was an overnight and prudent process. So we wanted to demonstrate that it is not an overnight process. It is a process that demands some learning and some building consensus and establishing investment policy before really any investment actions are taken. We invite you all to share. I know you're coming from different stakeholder groups at the university, and some asset managers and consultants are also on the call. But we invite you to share this roadmap. Each of the steps is linked to a page with a multitude of resources on our website. Next slide, please. At IEN, we talk about investment portfolios in the context of the risks and opportunities brought about by two of the greatest challenges facing us today: climate change and social inequity. Right now, we're having conversations about both, but most recently, we want to highlight our racial equity investing, which is a primer for college and university endowments. Many of you asked questions on the forms we asked you to fill out about how COVID is impacting endowment investing and the way we think about that, and about some of the social issues that everyone is impacted by and thinking deeply about right now. So this primer began in the making last January and came out just a few weeks ago, and just emphasizing that there is a call to action, which also might be something that you can bring to your university or college to give them some steps, beginning with the idea of committing to discussing racial equity at investment committee meetings, and hopefully at the next one. I want to give a big thank you to Joe Biernot, who is a trustee at Gettysburg College and is one of our executive committee members, for just staying honest about having this Endowment 101 webinar, because he feels it's so important to really ground discussions with various stakeholders in an understanding about endowments. And sometimes stakeholders at universities can feel a little bit lost in that conversation. Also a special thank you to NACUBO. We have two members of NACUBO on today. We'll talk about what that organization is, but for sharing their years of endowment management knowledge and partnering with us on this webinar. Next slide, please. So today with us, as I mentioned, we have two representatives from NACUBO. NACUBO is the National Association of College and University Business Officers. And on an annual basis, they do a study of about 800 endowments, varies a little bit year to year, and so have a wealth of knowledge about how endowments work. We're also joined by Jeff Menlin, the Vice President of Investments at Arizona State University Enterprise Partners, and Randy Strickland, Director and Investment Advisor at Cornerstone Capital Group, a consultant for institutional investors, including university endowments. So I want to make a mention before we get started also that this webinar will be followed by a community conversation. We've got about 120 registrants for this webinar. Very excited about that, but it came with 120 different questions and made us realize that we can't capture all of that in one webinar. So we're going to stick with the real meat of the conversation today, which is about how endowments work and how they're managed and how sustainable investing fits into that picture. So just to know that we will follow up with these, hopefully with these same presenters and others, to sit in breakout rooms with people and really get down to answer some of your more specific questions. And if that doesn't feel like enough, we can do, we can do a session 2, a 201. So just want to get this conversation started so that everyone can be grounded in the same sort of context around endowment management. Next slide. So each year, NACUBO, as I mentioned, the National Association of College and University Business Officers, does a survey of about 800 college and university endowments. So Ken and Liz are part of NACUBO, and they're here to share with you a little bit about the endowment landscape. Next slide. I'll turn it over to Ken first, and then maybe you can, Liz can join the conversation as makes sense.
Sure. Thanks, Alice. If you go to the next slide, Nicole, please. As was mentioned earlier, NACUBO has been doing an annual survey of endowments. Our survey has been running every year since 1974. So we have close to 50 years worth of data and information on how university endowments operate and what their goals and objectives are. I'm going to just talk a little bit about the schools that we survey, and then turn it over to my colleague, Liz Clark, to talk a bit more about some of the issues that we cover with our endowment survey. But as you can hopefully see from this slide, from our 2019 survey, which is our most recent, we had just under 800 institutions for 774. And collectively, those institutions had $630 billion of endowed assets. Just a word about that. The schools that we survey include colleges, universities, and their affiliated foundations. And they're public institutions, private institutions, and as I mentioned, private nonprofit, what I'll call IRS, or institutionally related foundations. So collectively, those organizations hold $630 billion of assets, but our survey does not cover the entirety of the higher education landscape. There are a number of schools that don't participate in our survey for various reasons, but our survey does cover a pretty broad spectrum. We have large public and private universities down to small community college and small private college foundations as well. So it's a sample of the endowment landscape, but not the entirety of. Most people who look at endowments are familiar with the really big institutional endowments that are in many cases over $1 billion, but those are not representative of the entire endowment landscape. But the median endowment in our survey is just over $144 million. So that the median meaning the value of the midpoint of our sample. So there are lots of institutions that we survey that have endowments of $100 million or less. So it's more typical for schools to have relatively small endowments. So as we talk further, that'll certainly have a bearing on what schools can and should use their endowments for. But the values are relatively modest at many campuses. One of the key questions that we get about endowments is their returns. This is as of June 30, 2019. So the time period of the survey does not cover what we've seen from the pandemic and the volatility in the markets since this survey was published. But as you can see, the last year for which we have full data, the return was about 5.3%. Most schools have a long-term goal of returning about 7%. So the last year's goal was a little bit below, last year's results were a little bit below most institutions' targets, but the long-term results were a little bit more encouraging, where we had 10-year average annual return of about a little bit more than 8%. So some positives in the return results. If you could go to the next slide. As I mentioned, most schools have a return objective of long-term return objective of 7%. Last year's 8.4% was a little bit higher than that, and reflected at that point the recovery from the financial markets. But we know that there's been a lot more volatility since then. Of course, the results range quite dramatically from the lowest to highest endowments. In our survey, we tend to see the schools with the larger endowments doing a little bit better than the smaller endowments. And that is primarily driven by the choices of investment vehicles. Large organizations tend to have more access to private equity, venture capital, other what are called non-traditional investment products or vehicles. So they tend to do over the long term, tend to do a little bit better than the smaller ones. The smaller endowments tend to be focused in general on public US and non-US stocks and bonds, which have done, historically have done, certainly done okay, but not as well as some of the other non-traditional asset classes that I mentioned before. We note that the returns are comparable to the rates of return as measured by the Higher Education Price Index, which is produced by Common Fund every year. Last year's returns were about on par with HEPI. So in general, endowments, at least in recent years, have kept pace with inflation, but have not done much greater than that. And that will have some implications for spending and other types of operations run by endowments. If you go to the next slide. And I will turn over back to Alice.
Okay, great. So thank you, Ken, for that landscaping. The next question we're going to dig into is really what are endowments, what are their sources of funds and the uses of funds, and why do they matter to a university? And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Minlin and then Liz. Jeff will give you a picture of this sort of at Arizona State University, and Liz will then broaden out that picture a bit about the universe.
Great, thanks Alice. Nicole, if you go to the next slide. So at a university, we tend to think of gifts in two buckets. There's current gifts, which are given with the idea that they're going to get spent right away. So they have a big impact all at once. This could be something for like a stadium remodel or maybe acquiring a technology for a lab. The other type of gift, which we're talking about today, is an endowed gift, which is meant to have an impact forever in perpetuity. So with an endowment, the donor is giving money to be invested with the idea that it's going to grow over time, and every year a portion of it, the growth is going to come out to benefit the designee that they created. And it's really about creating intergenerational wealth. So the endowment needs to be invested in a way so that it can grow by the payout and then cover inflation as well. And endowments are really important to the university because they really provide that known support from day one, where the university doesn't need to worry about the political landscape or tuition or other things like that. They know that this money is there for them to spend for some of these excellent programs. If you go to the next slide, I tend to think of the difference between endowment with a capital E and endowments with a lowercase e. So typically, and you heard earlier from Ken talking about university endowments and the way they look, we tend to think of the big pool. That's endowment with a capital E. What's happening though behind the scenes is that in our case, there's over 2,000 individual endowed gifts that get pooled together for that big endowment with the capital E. So each individual gift, endowed gift, we think of as an endowment with a lowercase e, and then the pool, how we invest them is the number that we tend to think about. So if you look at the landscape of what that endowed giving looks like at ASU, we've got, like I said, about 2,000 gifts. This is as of last year. Vast majority of those are going to the direct benefit of students and things like scholarships. And then you've got other things that are helping endow faculty chairs and helping with other athletic and academic programs as well. So if you go to the next slide, again, I think, endowments have become more and more important to the university. It allows really the university the flexibility to do kind of the non-traditional things that help distinguish it and make the university great. So offering more scholarships, building a more diverse student body, attracting and retaining top faculty, and giving them the flexibility to do cutting edge research, and really trying to have that flexibility to help solve the world's problems. If you go to the next slide, I think sometimes it's easier to see it with an example. So this is a gift we like to highlight. This is $1 million gift that was given to the university in 1992. And you can see the long-term impact that's had. As time's gone on, most universities found that most gifts are in that current gift bucket. People want to see the impact right away. And there's less endowment giving, but again, endowment giving is really important for the university. So the maroon line there is the market value of that gift as it's fluctuated with market returns. So it started off at $1 million in 1992 and grew to a little bit over $1.5 million over that time frame. Along the way, though, a little bit came out every year to go to the scholarship program that had been set up. So over this 20, 30-year period, it's had a cumulative payout of over $1.5 million as well. So that $1 million gift today is currently standing at a value of $1.5 million, but it's also had $1.5 million of scholarships that have come out of it. And then in our world, like a lot of universities, part of the payout also gets retained by the foundation to help with the overhead and the fundraising efforts. And we estimate that for every dollar we spend on staff and things like that they were able to raise $5 to $10 to support the university. So in this case, not only did $1.5 million go directly to the scholarship recipients over time, but we think that we've probably been able to raise another $5 million to support ASU as a whole from the revenue from this one endowment. So a big long-term impact, even though maybe in a given year it's only 50 or 60,000 that's coming out of it. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Liz to kind of give the NACUBO insight on endowments and why they matter.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to step back for a minute and just to add some framing context and come back to this. I would just say I love this slide 14 here. The first thing I want to remind the audience is that it's not just colleges and universities that have endowments. Zoos, hospitals, churches, orchestras, ballets, operas, museums, they are all also managing endowments and managing them similarly to support their funds. So just as Jeff has portrayed a $1 million gift here, I'm assuming it had a specific purpose. You can think of a ballet and perhaps a donor gave $1 million gift somewhere to support the annual mounting of the Nutcracker. So I want to remind folks it's not just colleges and universities managing these endowments. I want to mention that these are not the same thing as private family foundations. Colleges and universities and some of the organizations I just met are active operating organizations that use their endowment funds to keep themselves running. A private family foundation uses their investments typically to direct a specific area of interest, and the directors are typically family members. A college or university, it's a board of trustees who have a fiduciary responsibility to the mission of a college or university that they are responsible for. So one of the points of confusion I often hear is the comparison between endowments and foundations. I want to mention that these are not rainy day funds. I see that a lot in the news, and I even see higher education experts call endowments rainy day funds. Those are the reserve funds that an organization has. Those are rainy day funds. Endowments are not rainy day funds. Donors don't say, hey, use my gift for student aid unless there's a global pandemic, and in that case, you can use it for any operating purpose for which you might need. Endowments simply do not work that way, and please remember that endowments are not rainy day funds. With that, we can go to the impact of endowment spending slide on campus. And what you'll see here is what we learned from the 2019 NACUBO TIAA study of endowments. And you'll notice that this pretty closely tracks what Jeff showed you from Arizona State University. The bulk of endowments are directed to student financial aid. Many of the dollars are directed to endowment faculty positions, others to facilities or academic programs, and then we have the bucket for all other purposes. So you can see that endowments go to support a wide variety of activities on campus. And just to give you an illustration, on some campuses, for example, that may be a land-grant university, there may be an endowment fund for that state's 4-H program, which is run by the land-grant university. There may be an endowment gift in place for the hospital that a college or university may run. Endowments are not just there for student financial aid, they are there to support the mission of an institution. And so for some small colleges that may simply focus on undergraduate education at large comprehensive research universities, that could include education, research, the hospital and health-based research, museums, and other nonprofit mission-focused goals of the institution. We can go to the next slide. So as Ken pointed out, our study does not look at the entire universe of college and university endowments. This study just looked at a subset of those schools, the 774 colleges and universities that responded to our survey. But what we wanted to point here is the actual payout, the dollars that were spent by colleges and universities. And you can see that those dollars went up year over year. College and university endowments are managed in a way that colleges and universities can draw down a steady, growing, and reliable source of funding to help contribute to its operating budget. One example or point that I want to make here is that some people seem to better understand this concept if you compare it to your retirement savings. I've read great things about how millennials and Gen Z are already very active and smart about retirement planning. So while it's not apples to apples, I would just say if you're saving for retirement and you have a nest egg and you decide to retire at 65, you're not going to willy-nilly spend down what you have in that nest egg at 65. You're going to plan to invest that nest egg so that it can support you perhaps until 95 for 30 years. And on average, a retirement investor will tell you to draw down 4% of your retirement savings in order for it to last your 30 years of planned retirement. It's a similar concept here, except colleges and universities aren't managing those funds to last 30 years. They are required in many cases by their donors to make those funds last in perpetuity. So I will quickly go to the next slide. We can come back to this one. I want to give other speakers plenty of time and just say that we polled NACUBO members earlier this year to find out if they would be changing their spending rate in light of the current pandemic. And we actually found that most do not. 72% expect to maintain their current policy spending rate. So with that, Alice, I'll pause there and help the conversation move forward.
Great, thank you, Liz and Jeff, both. I think Liz's point is well noted about the spending. And I know in our conversation earlier, Jeff also mentioned, and as many of you are experiencing, that schools are spending some money on testing this year for COVID so that students can come back in. So I know ASU has done some work there. Maybe we can get back to that in the Q&A. So if you'll turn to the next slide, Nicole, what we want to look at next, a lot of stakeholders from universities ask us about, why do universities want certain returns, and what are they trying to seek? And I think Ken got to a little bit of this when he was talking about spending plus inflation, but maybe dig a little bit more into why that is so, Ken, just to be clear about that. And then maybe both you and Randy from Cornerstone can talk about what influences are at work today that might challenge that, including the evidence lately around the performance of sustainable investing in endowments that might challenge the resistance of some universities and colleges for going this path. So Ken, if you could just explain a little bit more, just dig into a little more about that spending plus inflation, why that is been the traditional return expectation. And then both of you could maybe answer the question about what might be challenging that today.
Sure. And I think Jeff's example of what goes on at ASU was an excellent illustration of this. The endowments are designed, endowed gifts are designed to last into perpetuity, which means forever. In order to do that, investment managers on campus have to create strategies that will allow the endowments to grow at a certain rate. Usually that target rate is about 7 to 8%, which would cover inflation plus fees and other sources, as Jeff said, to help foundations and universities cover their costs. Plus the most important thing is spending. Usually spending, Liz sort of touched on this, spending is around 4% on average in our study. So how do investment managers do that? And as you would probably guess, most of us are used to doing some investing. Liz mentioned retirement. When you invest for retirement, that's really a long-term prospect for most of us. You can't just put your money into a savings account. As inflation occurs, the value of your funds will decline. So you do have to take some risk in investing in stocks at the very least. And that's exactly what endowment managers do. They try to create portfolio strategies or asset allocation strategies that will allow their funds to meet their long-term objective. So if you assume that inflation is going to be around 2 to 3% a year on average, and if you assume you're going to spend about 4%, and then you have fees on top of that, on the long term, it's a fairly hefty target that institutions have to reach in order to reach this goal. What we found in our survey is that because, especially now with the markets being so volatile, it's gotten more difficult for institutions to meet that objective. I'm sure my colleagues will want to talk more about that, but I'll just say from our survey, we've seen the impact of market volatility is not just in the past year, but certainly over the last 10 years, where we came out of the Great Recession and had a good amount of market volatility then, and endowments declined for quite a bit during that time, and then recovered, and now we are somewhat back in the same predicament where at the beginning of the pandemic, endowments did experience a decline, but seem to have recovered since then. So that's hopefully gives you a little bit of lay of the land, and I will turn it over to my colleagues to explain further.
Hi, it's Randy Strickland, and so just wanted to touch on the issue of sustainability in investing. And there has been, as was referenced earlier, some resistance to that. And I know there were a lot of questions prior about why many colleges are not embracing sustainable investing. And part of it is sort of outdated notions of fiduciary responsibility. Part of it is just a lack of knowledge. And there's also this sense that if one is looking at issues, ESG, environmental, social governance issues, that those issues don't have, that type of investing doesn't have the same rigor as traditional investing. Cornerstone Capital Group, where my employer, we work with endowments, and all of our clients are invested in a sustainable fashion. And we've done a lot of work around, not just us, but some of our colleagues in the space, Cambridge Associates and NEPC and others, and many of the investment managers as well, that have shown that one can actually, not at a minimum, get the similar performance or the same performance, perhaps at a lower level of volatility over time. But there are a lot of studies that suggest that one can actually outperform by incorporating ESG across asset classes. So and clearly there is, on many college university campuses, there are movements to divest, and racial equity is now in vogue to talk about. We hope that that will continue. And the problem has been just this, on the part of the trustees of universities, is not necessarily having all the information that's available. So we're hopeful that in time that will change, and that as trustees either turn over or get exposed to the information and the data that's out there, they will see that indeed this is a better way to invest, that things like climate change, things like racial inequality, gender inequality, all of those are not only the moral thing to do, but we're not relying on morality. We're looking at data that suggests that all of these are, that confirms rather, all of these issues are indeed systemic risks. So if you look at it purely from a financial perspective, then one should clearly look at all of these issues. So there are some universities, the University of California system has chosen to divest, and they didn't divest for moral reasons. They're doing it purely because they believe that it's going to provide better returns over time. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but we're hopeful. I'll pass it back to Alice.
Okay, thanks, Randy. And I think we included some of your two slides that talk a bit about that performance. And Nicole, if you can advance the next slide.
Yeah. So this is just a list, and I think I saw that this presentation will be shared at our site, at our website, Cornerstone Capital, cornerstonecapinc.com. One can access this, the report Sacrifice Nothing, sort of the third iteration we did of this report. It's a meta study that shows exactly what I was just talking about. And on the next slide, what we've done is we have a number of clients and prospective clients, and just we do a lot of field building, a lot of research that just tries to educate the masses about sustainable investing. And these, I don't know if everyone can see, the type is a little small, or maybe it's just my bad eyesight, but there are a number of organizations that are looking to align their mission with their investments, and these are 4 separate and distinct portfolios on a total portfolio basis that are around specific themes. So it can be climate change, or racial equity, gender equity. And what is circled is the performance over time. We looked back, these are back-tested portfolios. We certainly don't guarantee that this will always occur, but there is a consistent theme that by incorporating companies in your portfolio or just looking at ESG factors, that one can indeed outperform. So it's we put this study together, these case studies together, just as an example of how one might have performed had they been invested according to these specific themes, with using real live managers, by the way, uh, um, and uh, and hopefully it'll just move the conversation forward about sustainable investing within endowment portfolios.
Great, thank you, Randy. And I'll mention too that IEN has put together recently, last spring, a study of 11 different endowments with different consultants from a range of consultants who had either divested or used ESG factors in their investing, or did a combination of both. And all of them were outperforming their traditional naive benchmarks as well as their peer benchmarks. So it'd be interesting to take a look at that. That is on our website under our resources.
And I should give a shout out to your brand new report on investing for racial equity. It's brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we're having many conversations about that over the next year. So we hope it get real action there. So the next question we'd like to address in the next slide, Nicole, would really be to talk about, so you're hearing from everyone that there's these spending parameters, and these return expectations because of their need to spend out money to support students. And you're hearing just now from Randy that we're seeing that the performance, that they're not taking a hit on performance the way many endowments thought. So the question is, sort of who makes the decisions about this? I don't know if it was Ken or Randy mentioned that just the need for educating trustees more. So I think it can be confusing when students and faculty and alumni try to figure out who is making those decisions. So if we could dive in a little bit to the roles of presidents, trustees, CIOs, investment committees. There's a whole landscaping here of different people involved in the decision making about the endowments in order to make good fiduciary decisions. So Randy, you've worked a lot with different all different kinds of stakeholders, including endowments. So if you can talk a little bit about what that looks like, and then Jeff could follow up specifically with what that looks like at his university.
Sure, and Jeff is certainly looking at it from a different vantage point, but we both would have to deal with boards of trustees and specifically investment committees, who are tasked with not only hiring, have the ultimate decision making on hiring and firing of investment managers, approving asset allocation, spending policies, etc. And they will hire firms like Cornerstone and many of our peer consultants to help them through the process of developing an investment policy statement, of developing a target asset allocation, rebalancing investments on a regular basis, hiring again the managers that fit from a return as well as a risk perspective, and then just the ongoing monitoring of those managers. So it can be a very difficult and challenging process over time. And you're dealing with individuals with lots of personalities. I'd let Jeff talk about that a little bit more. But back to shorter term issues. So when I worked years ago for an organization called Common Fund that manages university endowments, my boss at the time said, for endowments, it's not the next quarter that should matter, it's the next quarter century. And he was right about that, but in real life, decisions sometimes are made based on shorter term outlook. But overall, the consultants, or OCIO is outsourced CIO, very similar to an investment consultant, where you are the professionals that are hiring and firing these investment managers. And you could have the large endowments can have upwards of tens of not maybe closer to 100 different investment managers. So it's a very difficult process, and getting it right is critical, because as my colleagues earlier mentioned, the endowments are responsible for so much of the overall operational budget of a university. So I think that's all I have to say. I'll pass it off to Jeff and see if he has some additional comments based on what he's doing.
Sure. Yeah. Nicole, if you go to the next slide. So as Ken and Liz alluded to at the beginning, ASU is a public institution. So we have what's known as an institutionally related foundation. So our foundation is a separate legal entity, with the sole purpose of supporting the university. So when we talk about governance, it's separate and distinct from the university's governance. So in our case, we have a board of directors. We call them board of directors, not a board of trustees, but a board of directors, which oversees all of our activities. A subset of that board of directors has been selected for our investment committee. Tends to be 5 to 7 members that are part of our investment committee. We meet 4 times a year with our investment committee formally, and then on an ad hoc basis as needed. We really think of our investment committee as helping with the big picture strategy of the endowment and of our investment pools. So helping think about the payout, and think about the foundation fee, and think about our asset allocation and those types of really key decisions. There's always this natural push and pull. The higher your payout, the more current impact there is, but the higher the chance that maybe you don't meet those intergenerational wealth objectives. So we're always trying to think about those issues and how the market dynamics and capital market assumptions might impact that. My team then works really closely with our investment committee to execute their strategy. We've hired what's known as an outsourced chief investment officer, BlackRock in our case, that implements or executes on that strategic asset allocation. They're helping us with the investment strategy, and then the actual manager selection within each of our asset classes. And then those individual managers then are picking the individual stocks. In our case, and this is like a lot of schools, we don't have a lot of individual securities directly. Most of our investments are in either institutional mutual funds or commingled funds. But this is there's a lot of layers of governance in there. We think good governance results in good returns, and I think it really is important that there's a good understanding of each of the roles of each of these groups. But again, in ASU's case, more than 90% of our endowed gifts are restricted, meaning like Liz had said earlier, that it's not rainy day funds. As the university faces spending needs because of COVID, we can't just tap into the endowment for these purposes. They have specific scholarship or professorship purposes. So the committee is really stewards of the donor's money, and this is where the fiduciary concept really plays in. So I'll pause there and hand it back to you, Alice, if we want to dive into other topics, or I know we're kind of coming up at time here, so I don't know if we want to go into Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think I'll take 1 minute if I could get a 1 minute response from each of you on, what the future of a sustainable investing in endowments looks like, and what influences are challenging the status quo, and any area where we're seeing from our endowments in our network is addressing a number of issues, including climate risk, thinking about, challenging the idea that ESG investing violates fiduciary duty, taking a more active role as you are at ASU and with your student managed fund in engaging the companies they own, and asking for more information about the decision making and the diversity in people making decisions at asset management firms and consultants. So those are some of the things we're seeing. I don't know if each of you could take in turn something that you're seeing, and then we'll try to wrap up with some questions. So while we're doing that, I see there are some question and answers in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we have not been able to open the Q&A. And Nicole sent out an email, a message through chat to just use the chat box. So if you do have a question in Q&A right now, while these answers are being provided, please move them over to chat so that we can see them. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jeff. I don't know if you want to get started again on just something that you're seeing
Sure.
about the future of sustainable investing in endowments.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely it was kind of like the green wave. I think there's a lot of momentum there. ASU has been a leader in sustainability for a while. We had the first school sustainability. So this has been a topic that's been front of radar for us for a long time, and you're starting to see everybody else really rise to that. I think COVID maybe paused it briefly, but we're seeing kind of in response to that both the tangible benefits of it from both an environmental perspective as well as a social justice perspective. In our case, we have a separate ESG subcommittee. I didn't mention that's elevating these topics and thinking about them in a more direct basis. We created a separate pool with a specific mission alignment mandate in order to be more innovative and proactive in how we think about testing different sustainable strategies, with the idea that we can elevate them to our main pool. We've created we have 5 different student managed funds, but we've created one with a specific sustainability mandate. So I think, again, I think the tide is starting to turn. I think there was a lot of, confusion maybe in the past or misperception that talking about sustainability or ESG was more values based, and it was going to be old, excluding of fin stocks. And so I think now as we've seen it, it's not a either or, it's a way to enhance returns or reduce risk. And so I think it's becoming more part of the core fiduciary perspective, not instead of. So I think there's going to be more and more schools that are more and more active in this regard.
Great, thanks. Liz, do you want to take a shot at the question?
I'll jump in and kind of answer one of the questions that came in as well. I just want to comment on fiduciary responsibility. Fiduciary responsibility itself is not an outdated notion. It is real, right, and good for the donors and for the institutions themselves. If there is a gift contract with a donor, the institution must uphold it, and there are uniform state laws around which the investment managers essentially must seek growth as well as the ability to have income to spend for purposes of that. That's more of a 201 than a 101 concept, but I do want to say that fiduciary responsibility is real, right, and good. What I do think is a little outdated is the imagination that some fiduciaries have as to how they can invest to uphold these responsibilities. And I think we're in a really exciting time right now. We've seen great research from the Knight Foundation. I love what Randall just shared from Cornerstone Capital Group. We have at Nakubo taken a deep dive at our own endowment study data, and through analysis seen that using these strategies do not appear to have an impact on investment performance, and we need to get that word out. So what I do want to stress is it's not fiduciary responsibility we should be walking away from, it's the imagination that we can bring to that responsibility.
And just thank you for clearing that up. If I using that term outdated, if I somehow made it think that the notion of being a good fiduciary is outdated, but I appreciate you adding clarity to that. I agree wholeheartedly with what you said.
Yeah, I love that point about imagination. And Randy, do you want to, I know we talked about a number of things, coming up lately about things including in the inequity and the size of endowments from one school to another. And there was a question here about, smaller endowments at HBCUs and how the 7% return is doable. So I don't know if you want to maybe address something around the size and the different pressures
Sure.
on endowments?
Well, small endowments have, the challenges smaller endowments have are perhaps access to certain managers that might have larger minimums. It doesn't mean, though, that they cannot get a breadth of diversification in terms of managers, strategies, asset classes, and also attain the that 7% return that is required. HBCUs, and I've worked with a number of them in the past. There are a number that are very strained in terms of resources, and they may be relying very heavily on spending from their endowments, and that can also impact their asset allocation because they don't want to take an inordinate amount of risk because any short-term fluctuations might impact their ability to achieve their spending policy. But smaller endowments, again, in total, there are also a number of fund-to-fund managers that can give them fees are a little bit higher in a fund of funds versus directly with a investment manager, but you can still, and through those, you can access maybe some of those larger, more perhaps, or in some cases, some boutique managers, particularly in terms of private investments, venture capital, private equity, hedge funds. So it is there. It isn't out of the realm of possibility, even though they might be a bit resource constrained.
Thanks, Randy. And so as you can see, we're trying to address some questions here. We have about 2 minutes left, but Ken, I don't know if you want to wrap up something either on a question that you're seeing come in through the chat box, or if you want to address the sort of future of sustainable investing in endowments and what influences might be challenging the traditional way and challenging them to be more imaginative, as Liz said.
No, I agree with everything that has been said thus far. We've definitely seen a sea change this year, and I suspect going forward that there will be more attention that endowments will play in this area. The one additional comment I will make is I think this will certainly, in addition to affecting the ESG decisions, this will also likely affect the managers who are tasked or hired by institutions to make those decisions. I suspect that there will be additional calls for and pressures on universities to diversify their managers and consider hiring more diverse managers, more women and people of color owned management firms. I'm already seeing evidence of that with colleagues, and I suspect that will continue as well, and all to the good. I think, as Liz said, the fiduciary responsibilities are still there, but being more imaginative and more open to new strategies, ideas, and people involved in these decisions, both from the fiduciary side and from the asset manager side, is a good thing for higher ed and a good thing for our society.
Great, thank you. And I know we're up against the hour, so I wanted to remind it. I think we've tried to answer some of these questions, but we do have a community conversation that we'll send out to everybody who's on this webinar and others to come join, in which we'll have these panelists and others from universities and consultant field to help answer some of these questions. It's a very good question that's come up here and on and in our questions that we got asked prior to this about the conversation. How do you have the conversation with trustees and endowment decision makers? And we'll dig into that a little bit more. But I think, as Jeff mentioned, one way is through sustainable managed funds, student sustainable managed funds, so they can kind of lead the way and show what they're doing. And we encourage them to talk to their endowment professionals. So there is a network called Silk. I think Jeff has added that to the chat. And we will address your questions on an upcoming community conversation, and hope you can all join.